then, and look at that. There are no property rights in Charter, but that's a good thing. Okay? Because when we look at Section 1 of the Charter, again, it goes, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limitations prescribed by law. So if there were property rights in the Charter, our natural property rights in the Charter, they could, subject to reasonable limitations, saying, well, we don't think you can handle that kind of property anymore, deny us the guarantee to it. Versus, when we look at the Canadian Bill of Rights, which does recognize our right to property, its notwithstanding clause section says this, Section 2. Every law of Canada shall, unless it's expressly declared by an act of Parliament that it shall operate notwithstanding, in spite of the Canadian Bill of Rights, be so construed as applied as not to abrogate, abridge, or infringe, or to authorize the abrogation, abridgment, or infringement of any of the rights and freedoms herein recognized and declared. So what that means is, when you have absolute title to your private property, no statute can be written can be interpreted to deprive you of that property unless it states so in clear and unequivocal language. So it becomes, in one essence, when you look at it, then yeah, there are no property rights in the Charter, but that is a good thing, especially when we now understand everyone's property rights aren't the same. Ours are absolute. Ours are protected beyond our recognition, as long as we don't use it to hurt other people. These guys' property rights, they want to pass an amendment, boom, they take more and more property. How do you think over the years they've been able to enslave more and more people? Because they offer you a benefit 5, 10, 15 years ago, and then once they get all the masses lining up for the benefit, then they start chipping away at the legislation. Then they start making it more and more in their favor versus your favor, leaving you go, the cost of this benefit's getting pretty out of control. Okay? So that's really the simplicity of it is when you hear our government saying there's no property rights in the Charter, the next thing you should say is, and that's a good thing. Let's keep it that way, because now we understand why, and we don't want them in there, because this are protected a lot more. So we're going to move on to this next section, look at the other thing we hear, we're taught since birth, basically, income tax is certain as death. Just accept it, get over it, don't question it, move on. Is that a reality? What is it? So we're going to spend really a very short period of time looking at it, because when we understand, especially this, when we understand now that not everyone has the same property rights, this may make a lot more sense. Before we sort of get into looking at some of the meat of it, we want to stop and look at this predominance of fundamental law. Okay, this is one thing they will never teach us. Because if we understood this one principle, we realize the predominance of our rights. It comes out of Pierre-André Cote's book called The Interpretation of Legislation in Canada. Okay, it's subsection 3, consistency with fundamental law. It goes, although not formally incorporated in the Constitution, Parliament has nevertheless endowed certain statutes with a predominance over other legislation. A hierarchy in law, effectively. Among them, in federal law, is the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Quebec law, the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. All federal and provincial legislation should be construed in a way consistent with these fundamental laws. Canadian Bill of Rights is Section 2, which we just looked at. The Charter of Human Rights is Freedoms is Section 53, and it goes on. Moreover, the Canadian Bill of Rights, Section 2, renders any inconsistent statute inoperative unless it mentions that will operate notwithstanding the Bill of Rights. Quebec's charter has the same rule, but only regarding some of its sections, 9 to 38. So all across this country, we have these pieces of legislation which literally rise above all other legislation. Which every other piece of law that you look at, you have to look at it relative to this predominance of fundamental law, which is the recognition and protection of your human rights. Okay? So let's move on to, interpreting statutes is a very in-depth, complex thing, fun once, but it takes time to do that. We don't have the time here, so we're just going to look at something, a really good anchor point to keep in mind as we pursue here. This comes from R versus McIntosh in 1995. It's Supreme Court, page 686. Chief Justice Lamer he goes, I would agree with Pierre-André Cote's observation in his book, The Interpretation of Legislation in Canada, at page 231, that since the judge's task is to interpret the statute, not to create it. As a general rule, interpretation should not add to the terms of the law. Do we hear what that's telling us? In the law, it's what is said is what is said. Okay? When we want to add our own opinion, our own emotional attachment, it should say this. The judges of the Supreme Court say they're not allowed to do it. What gives us the right to think we can do it? Okay? It goes on to say, legislation is deemed to be well drafted and to express completely what the legislators wanted it to say. That's a very good fundamental point to really hang on to as you're looking for how do statutes relate to your natural rights, to your property rights, to your rights to your free speech, to the rights of association. And so you need to keep this in mind, that if it doesn't say certain things in there, maybe it wasn't supposed to be in there in the first place. And here's a great example of that. In Search for Clear and Unequivocal Language. Okay? Now that we know there's two types of persons in law, maybe we'll spend some pursuing, does law use natural person in it? Great example of that is the Bank Act. Person means a natural person, an entity, or a personal representative. Is a natural person in here? Is there any question? Okay? Why? Parliament, like the Supreme Court said, legislation is deemed to be well drafted. They wanted it in there, guess what they did? They put it in there. Let's take it to the next one. Here's another act called the Excise Tax Act, specifically Part 9, the section about GST. Individual means a natural person. Any question on that? Parliament, this is evidence. Parliament, when they want to talk about or create legislation surrounding or regarding a natural person, they make sure you know it's in there. Let's look at this one. The Income Tax Act. Individual and person. Do you see anything missing there? There's no natural person in there. Now, one of two things, either Parliament forgot, okay, or a natural person was never intended to be directly included in the Income Tax Act. Because there's evidence that if Parliament ever wanted him in there, they actually could put him in there. And I specifically took the definition of the word person from an income tax, from a 1999 version of the income tax. The reason is because this is where a lot of our research started. But just recently, and back then, in the early days, people would go, oh, well, it's just, Parliament forgot. They're going to fix that. They'll just put natural person in there. Fine. Okay. Well, just recently, they did make an amendment to the definition of the word person. What they put in here in this list of, or it goes heirs, executors, administrators, or other legal representatives, they went and put liquidators of a succession. So since, say, 1999 to today, Parliament had plenty of opportunity to make that amendment if it was an actual fact and oversight on their part to have a natural person subject to the Income Tax Act. Okay? They didn't. The reason why is because they can't. Because what was the predominance of law? All of these things have to be read with respect for our human rights and freedoms. One of them being our right to property. Okay? So let's read this definition of the word person. See, now obviously I'm assuming most people here pay income tax. Have paid it, we've been good citizens. The government speaks, we obey, right? What more could they ask from us? Okay? So let's read it and see, well, how could we be in here? Because either, one, they're corrupt and they've been lying to us, or maybe there's a mechanism that throws us in here. It goes person, or any word or expression descriptive of a person, includes any corporation. Now, in the Income Tax Act, the word corporation just means an incorporated company, because they've redefined it in there to mean that. Okay, so we got to focus that. And any entity exempt because of subsection 149. Well, we're quite convinced that's not us, because if we were some kind of exempt entity, we would not even worry about it, would we? Okay, so we're not that. Say from tax under Part 1 on all or part of the entity's taxable income, and the heirs, executors, administrators, or other legal representatives of such a person. That's all that's in there. Effectively, there's three types of people in there. You got your corporations. Let's just give a visual of this. You got your corporations, which are incorporated companies. You got Section 149, exempt entities. And then you got this other thing called legal representatives of such a person, of one of these persons. If that's all in there, then how come we're doing what we're doing? Because they told us? Because the law apparently, at least on the surface, doesn't show a natural person's directly in there. So maybe it's best